I would like to welcome you today. We got a couple more people. Hold on, let me let them in really quickly. I would like to welcome you today to the Mirowitz Center and our program Blue Song, St. Louis in the Life and Work of Tennessee Williams by Henry Schvey and Judy Newmark. Henry Schvey is professor of drama and comparative literature at Washington University in St. Louis. Prior to taking his appointment in St. Louis in 1987, Professor Schvey was an associate professor and director of American Literature program at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He received his BA in comparative literature with honors from the University of Wisconsin in Madison and his MA and PhD from Indiana University. In addition to the book we will be discussing today, he is the author of 5 other books, innumerable essays and reviews, and 4 original plays, has directed a very large number of those plays. And we welcome Judy Newmark, who was the St. Louis Post-Dispatch theater critic from 1995 until she retired last year. Starting at the Post right out of college, she held all kinds of jobs there, including fashion editor and editor of the Old Sunday magazine, PD. Today, she reviews theater on her blog, judyact2.com. An adjunct member of the Washington University faculty, she teaches classes in art criticism and in theater. She's the author of the Muni Songs of St. Louis Summers, a lavishly illustrated coffee table book that makes an excellent gift. Please welcome Henry and Judy today.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you.
Henry, you had an experience that I can't imagine a professor, a literature or drama professor in America wouldn't love, and it was miraculous, it seems. Can you tell everybody what happened in that New Orleans bookstore where you happened to be looking for Williams memorabilia?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to, just before beginning, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, my audience, and also particular thanks go to Stephen Cohen and Judith, Oliver, and of course also to you, Judy, for inviting me. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
As far as this sort of discovery, and it was a kind of miraculous thing. First of all, I just need to go back a step to let people know that when I came here in 1987, I was informed by a colleague in the Performing Arts Department. I came from Leiden University, as Judith said, to chair the Performing Arts Department. And I was told really on my first day here in 1987 that Tennessee Williams attended Washington University briefly, and that he left rather unhappily, and that his departure, his sudden departure, concerned a particular play called Mi Vasha that he had written, and that was rejected. He received honorable mention, 4th place, in a contest, and the cash prizes went to the first 3 people, one of whom was A.E. Hotchner. In any event, I read this play and I was told it wasn't very good. And I read it, and there was nothing in my first reading of the play to make me feel differently about it. So, having said that, in 2004, Washington University celebrated its sesquicentennial. And I thought this would be a good time to remind people of Tennessee Williams' connection with Washington U. And I directed a production of The Glass Menagerie, with Williams, of course, famous St. Louis play, the play that is so profoundly autobiographical in many ways. And I thought, wouldn't it be a good idea as a curtain raiser to just perform, have the students perform this little one act called Mi Vasha, which I had read and which had historical significance, and it had not ever been published before. So we went ahead with this, but in rehearsals, I realized that the one-act play was really not working. And I just tweaked it a little bit and decided that it's a play about basically an armaments manufacturer. And it was written in 1937, in the spring of 1937. And it describes a kind of a side of Tennessee Williams that people aren't aware of, someone that is really politically engaged. And this man is doing business deals for armaments on both sides of a sort of fictional war. Anyway, the thing that makes the play very interesting is that he keeps his wife, who is delusional, if not completely insane, locked in their bedroom. And the plot of the play, very, very briefly, is that the prime minister smuggles in a gun to the wife, and she shoots her husband at the end. It's very melodramatic. And we were staging it, and the play didn't work. So I suggested putting this dictator figure, whose name is Vasha, on a literal pedestal, on a desk 10 feet off the ground. Suddenly the play worked as fantasy. So now, this was in 2004 that we put on this play. And in 2005, I went to a small conference in New Orleans, a scholars conference, to talk about this play. Remember, the play had never been published before.
Or performed, correct?
Or performed. It had never been performed before. Thank you. And I was rummaging around in a bookstore, and I asked naively if they had any Tennessee Williams materials or memorabilia or signed copies. And I was handed a sheaf of papers in a plastic folder, including one that struck my eye. And it was a blue book of the kind that universities still use for examinations. And I opened the blue book and I realized pretty quickly that this was Tennessee Williams. It was, of course, he wasn't Tennessee then.
It was
Thomas Williams. And it was his final examination in Greek, in ancient Greek, which he failed. And it was one of the reasons for his leaving Washington University, along with the reception to this play that I just mentioned. So I was there to discuss the play, and suddenly I found this Greek exam. And in thumbing through the exam, I came across a poem at the last page. And I'll show you a slide of it at the end of our conversation. But at the end of the exam, there was a poem, and it was titled Sad Song. But underneath the word sad, was erased. It was all in pencil, and over it was written blue song. And this is the poem that I found. I'm just going to read it to you so that you have a sense of why this was such an astonishing discovery. This is what he wrote. And in my opinion, this poem sort of captures Williams' entire attitude toward St. Louis and toward his studies at that time and feeling trapped. I am tired. I am tired of speech and of action. If you should meet me upon the street, do not question me, for I can tell you only my name and the name of the town I was born in. But that is enough. It does not matter whether tomorrow arrives anymore. If there is only this night and after it is morning, it will not matter now. I am tired. I am tired of speech and of action. In the heart of me, you will find a tiny handful of dust. Take it and blow it out upon the wind. Let the wind have it, and it will find its way home. So I stood there literally in this bookstore shaking, because I realized that not only the Greek exam, but the poem was something that presumably no one had ever seen before. And that's really what I discovered there. It was a kind of remarkable thing. But at that point, it was just the discovery of the poem. And I contacted Washington University's library, and fortunately, they were able to purchase the poem and the blue book. I didn't tell anyone except for the library about the poem inside, because I thought that that would increase the price many-fold. So that's
You know, Henry, as poems go, that one sounds like a suicide note.
yes. I think that's it, and I think that's true, and I think it does describe a kind of suicidal feeling at that moment that he had. He was, remember, he was failing. This was his second attempt at university education. He was 26 years old and still an undergraduate at the time. He had started at the University of Missouri in 1929. And when his father found out that he was failing ROTC, his father pulled him out of the university and put him to work at the International Shoe Company, where he worked for 3 years. And it was only in 1936 when his grandparents sent him a check, his sainted grandparents, as he put it, he could re-enroll at Washington University. And he spent a year as a student not candidate for a degree. And then in 1936, he enrolled. And all of a sudden, after this 1 year, at the age of 26, he was failing ancient Greek. And he had written this play that had been rejected not only by his student peers, but by the professor. And he desperately longed to prove himself and to win the cash prize for best one-act play, because that would justify his sort of vagrancy to his father, who really had no respect for what he was doing.
Could you tell us a little bit about his family life, Henry?
Yes.
It was not a wonderful family.
No, one of the reasons he was so unhappy, and I think that Judy, you're right about it being something like a suicide note. One of the reasons he was so trapped was because of his family life. Imagine this. So his father was a bullying alcoholic. His father ridiculed his own son for his effeminate ways.
He called him Miss Nancy, you right.
Called him Miss Nancy. Not something that is designed to inspire a lot of self-confidence. His mother loved him deeply, but the love was a kind of smothering love. And she dictated all his behaviors, including his dislike of St. Louis. She decided that it was a snobbish place. And then the third member of the family was his sister, Rose, who in adolescence was diagnosed with dementia praecox. Today we
an old-fashioned term for schizophrenia.
Exactly. And at the time of his year at Washington University, she was at St. Vincent's Sanatorium, and she could be violent and was subject to rages, and had even begun to accuse their father of sexual abuse.
That doesn't seem impossible.
No, it doesn't. I mean, we don't know. It doesn't seem impossible. In any case, he was very controlling. The mother was controlling as well. There was no touch in the home. His mother was very frightened of anything that had to do with physical affection. And at the same time, he was visiting his sister in an institution. So things could not have been worse. Although he had had a number of plays produced in St. Louis, not professional, but amateur productions by the Mummers Theater Company, he felt he felt trapped. Completely.
But unlike our stereotypical notion of community theater, the Mummers were an adventurous group, and they fed that side of the politically engaged side. Henry makes a wonderful point in the book, which I recommend. This is a funny thing to say about a biography of a it's kind of a page turner. It's very well written. It's an enjoyable read. I mean, Henry's book. I'm sure much of Williams is quite enjoyable also. But he makes the point that we don't like our artists to slip out of their, we want to put that square peg in the square hole and so forth. But we do the same thing to Miller and to Williams. I wonder if you could talk a little about that.
Well, yes, we associate Williams with a certain kind of playwriting, specifically the lyricism that we find in Glass Menagerie or perhaps Streetcar Named Desire. But the early Williams was very influenced by this avant-garde theater company called the Mummers. And they did socially relevant plays, disturbing plays. And Williams was trained in that style. And so his early work shows us a completely different side of his genius. And it is genius. He wrote a number of plays that were produced here locally and well received, actually. One is centered in an Alabama coal mine, and the Post-Dispatch reviewed it, even though it was written by Williams, who was then a student, and talked about the keen ear of the playwright, and that the playwright must have done tremendous amount of research in Alabama in the coal mines. Well, not only had Williams never been to Alabama, but he had never been to a mine.
And there are
This
coal
was
mines that are
entirely
really
imagined.
close on the other side.
Yes. Yeah, he had intended to visit a mine in Illinois to do some research, but that trip had been canceled, and so he entirely made up the language of this coal mining town. The point is that this is a writer who, at a very early age, was in some ways formed, knew what he wanted to write about, and but as Judy said, we try to we pigeonhole artists, and the early plays that Williams wrote before moving to New Orleans in 1938 show a different side of his genius, but it's nevertheless an important side.
We always think of Glass Menagerie as the great St. Louis play, and I'm not disputing that. And we think of Streetcar as the great New Orleans play, and I'm not disputing that either. But Henry, in his book, sees a lot of St. Louis in this particular slice of New Orleans. You talked a lot about the domestic violence and about the poverty that he had witnessed in St. Louis in the 1930s. I wonder if you might expand a little on this.
Yeah, so really, really interesting question, which encompasses many different levels. I told you that he worked between 1932 and 1935 on Washington Avenue at the International Shoe Company. Well, that brought him, remember, this is the height of the Depression, and it brought him past the Hoovervilles. He saw artists donating their free time to teach. He saw people who were homeless, who were drunks, who were strung out on drugs, things that a normal middle-class young man would not have seen. Williams' family was not poverty-stricken. His father was a manager at the International Shoe Company. So he would travel downtown to get to Washington Avenue, and this brought him in touch with these people. Nothing was lost on Williams. So he became in some ways socially aware through the limitations of having to go to this job. And this sort of power of observation was something that was really crucial to him.
He gave at least one interview in the Post-Dispatch in which he disparaged St. Louis vociferously. And a lot of people remember only that.
Yes.
But he also returned to St. Louis time and time again, sometimes for medical treatment at the old Renard Hospital, which was the psychiatric hospital at Barnes.
Yes.
and he is buried here. You contend that his whole adult life had been an effort to get past St. Louis, and yet he was drawn irrevocably. What
Yes.
was drawing him?
I think that St. Louis was the seat of what a psychologist might call a traumatic injury. The injury was many-fold, really. It was the brutality he experienced at the hands of his father. It was the smothering love of his mother. And it was, above all, the separation from his sister, whom he felt they were more like twins. They were known as the couple growing up in Mississippi. Tennessee Williams moved here when he was 7 years old. So I'm talking about his very early years. And
Where
as
he had the comfort that he would lose later of loving grandparents who were pretty much involved in his life, his mother's parents, and the father was an Episcopal priest. He was a kind man and a considerate man.
yes,
And they also had a wonderful nanny, a Black woman.
mm-hmm.
And then they moved to St. Louis and it's all gone.
It was all
And
gone.
he's 7.
Yes. And I think the thing that was sort of pivotal was, and in some ways traumatized him, is that growing up in Mississippi, they lived in the rectory of his grandfather's home, and his father was on the road. When they moved to St. Louis in 1918, arrived at Union Station, and my book shows contrasting images of the train station at Clarksdale, Mississippi, and the Union Station in St. Louis, to dramatize the extraordinary shift in sophistication and in urbanization. When they arrived here, they were forced to live together as a family, as a nuclear family. The grandparents were, for all intents and purposes, gone, and they were forced upon themselves. And the parents never got along. The marriage was a very deeply unhappy one. Ironically enough, his mother, Edwina, used the money that Williams bequeathed her. He gave her 50% of the royalties from the Glass Menagerie to essentially kick her husband out of the house. And so it provided some freedom for her at last. But the point is that the years in St. Louis were desperately unhappy. He was predisposed to find them unhappy because of his mother, as Judy mentioned in an interview shortly after he had left St. Louis, or a few years afterwards, with the Post. He called St. Louisans cold and smug and so forth. But the contention of my book, and the essential thesis of my book, is that artists don't always tell the truth. D.H. Lawrence has a famous quote, "Never trust the teller, trust the tale." And my approach to Tennessee Williams' work was to understand that St. Louis was always with him, and he could never slough it off, kick it aside the way he wanted to. His life, in some ways, was a pilgrimage to discard St. Louis, to pretend that he found himself sexually and artistically in New Orleans, which is true. But all of those years, those formative years between 1918 and 1938, he was a resident, and in some cases a non-resident while he was in Columbia, Missouri, of St. Louis. And what Judy describes is that the book outlines the ways in which St. Louis never left him. And it literally never left him in the return to Barnes Hospital, the Renard wing of Barnes Hospital in 1969. It obviously has not left him in the fact that he's buried a few minutes from here in Calvary Cemetery. But my argument is that it never left him artistically. He is always writing about his family, and he is always writing about his sister. And even in plays where the setting is completely different, like
Tokyo.
A Streetcar Named Desire. Yes, that in some ways it's a masked version of St. Louis, or there are aspects of St. Louis. Sorry, Judy.
No, I just said Tokyo even.
Yes, absolutely.
St. Louis and his play set in Tokyo.
Yes.
There's St. Louis all over the place. And one small detail that really struck me is in his Southern plays, his Southern characters, there is that lyricism, there's that cherry orchard hovering in the background. There are flowers, there are scented breezes. Those of us who remember why Raymond Tucker from the engineering school at Washington U was the mayor will recall that before Mayor Tucker took over, this city was filthy. A mayor was elected, an engineer was elected mayor to clean up the smog that was so terrible. Yes. And it must have struck this Southern little boy from Clarksdale, Mississippi, as so ugly and maybe hard to breathe.
Yes.
It got, my mother used to say you couldn't wear, you wore white gloves to work, but they were filthy by the time you got off the bus.
Yes, when I started working on this book, I thought that Williams called St. Louis Saint Pollution just as a descriptor to show his contempt. Only during the research process did I realize that that was literally the case. And so in Williams' plays, the fact that you can never see the sky is very important in St. Louis, in the St. Louis plays. He
and
felt
one of those early plays is called Candles to the Sun, about these men in a mine. There's no light, it's horrible. And yet they're holding up those candles to the sun.
Absolutely
they
right.
crave light and clean air. And to some extent, you get a little bit of that, although certainly the horrible family dynamic in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, don't you?
Yes, yes. I think that the sort of imperious father figure, Big Daddy in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and the son who is clearly diminished, Brick, who is in that play, of course, a literal cripple. But I think in some ways, Williams is dramatizing the fact that his family in some ways crippled him. And he's crippled by alcoholism in Cat.
And he's also, there is certainly a suggestion that Brick and his friend Skipper were lovers. And here's the artistic switch he makes. The father is oddly accepting of this. Well, that happens sometimes. But all right, he's dead now. Get on with your life and give me that grandson.
Yes. Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't write about Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in the book, but as you ask the question, I think you can see how that also fits into this sort of template of St. Louis plays. It's about a father and son. And in many respects, Williams grew to, if not admire his father, but to see him as a more attractive figure. It's interesting, even in Glass Menagerie, he's a telephone man who fell in love with long distance. But at the end of the play, the narrator, Tom Wingfield, chooses to follow in his father's footsteps. His father represents a kind of a longed for freedom. And Williams, under psychoanalysis in the late 1950s, felt that he had misunderstood his father and that his father suffered from the same kind of constriction as Williams did. In other words, he wanted to get out. He wanted to get onto the road. He was ill-suited for a managerial desk job, and he saw his father with a new kind of pity and odd sympathy. Yes.
You write about a poem he wrote pretty clearly about his father, the man in the chair, the man in the stuffed chair. What's it called? Yeah,
it's a personal essay, we would call it today, a kind of piece of creative nonfiction called The Man in the Overstuffed Chair. Yes. And he describes his father as being one part and parcel with this chair and the lamp that hovers over it. But the chair and the lamp can't really be moved. But he also describes his father as someone who entered a room with the sense that he was going to tear the room down, tear the building down. And so that violence was also a part of his father, but it's a kind of frustrated power. And I would argue also that we get some of that domestic violence in Streetcar. I believe you alluded to that earlier in your question about Streetcar. His father was, Tennessee Williams' father, C.C. Williams, was actually had his ear bitten off in a poker fight while he was at International Shoe. So Tennessee Williams knew about domestic violence. And
His
yes,
wife, did he not?
he also perhaps accidentally broke his wife's nose. She was holding the door against him and he slammed into it and broke her nose on one of these occasions. So yes, there were scenes, and he was violent toward certainly toward Rose in a way that obviously I would say influenced her illness and helped
Well, it certainly
cause.
didn't help.
That certainly didn't help. It certainly didn't help.
Henry, you wanted to show you. We have some pictures, a slideshow that Henry has prepared to go along with his book, and I think this would be a good time. And after that, we'll take questions.
Thank you. And I
Are
want to
we
thank
ready,
you.
Judith, to do the slides?
Let's put up the slides now. Thank you. Okay, we'll just advance them. This is the cover photo. This is a picture actually after Williams left St. Louis and escaped, in his terms, to New Orleans and eventually New York. Next slide, please. We'll go through these rather quickly. So this is a picture of mother and son back in Clarksdale, Mississippi. He was born actually in Mississippi, and he always longed for and romanticized the South. Next slide. Here he is at age 5. As I mentioned, until the age of 7, he grew up as the sort of privileged child of he was the grandson of the rector of this parish in Clarksdale. Next slide. These are 2 photographs of his father, one with him on the left and as branch manager of the International Shoe Company. Next slide. This is an interesting photograph. His sister Rose is in the foreground, along with his mother right behind Rose, and his grandmother, whom he called Grand, in the background on the right as you look at it. And then Williams is sitting there with his leg crossed, and next to him is his nurse, Ozzie, who was a favorite nurse and used to tell tall tales to the children, and it was very influential. All of these are part of the kind of mythology that Williams drew upon in referring to himself as a Southern writer. He saw himself and wanted to be seen as a Southern writer, not a Midwestern writer. Next slide. This is and we can combine this with a next slide. This is the passenger depot at Clarksdale. The next slide shows the contrast.
Oh my.
Oh my. These are the 2 train stations. One on the left, the one he left in 1918, and this is where he arrived in St. Louis at Union Station. And I think the juxtaposition of these photos tells you all you need to know. He left a rural world, but it was also a backward world. He, in St. Louis, and I talk about this in the book, he also received many positive things, most notably a first-class education. He went to some very progressive schools, the Ben Blewett Junior High School, University City High School. Obviously, these were places that were at the forefront of education in the day. And he never would have gotten the kind of training or encouragement for his literary gifts in the Deep South. Next slide. Here is the happy family. Their first home was a boarding house. And then they moved 9 times while they were in St. Louis, largely as a result of Edwina Williams' dissatisfaction she wanted to move west. Each of the moves is further and further and further west until she finally escaped the city and moved to Clayton near the end.
And they must have been in U City at some point.
Yes, yes, they did. Absolutely. They were in U City, of course. Absolutely. Next slide. Yes. This is the first school which he did not enjoy, and that was Eugene Field, with its two sort of prison-like watchtowers hovering over the school grounds. And Williams, as a young child, was really bullied and mocked because of his Southern accent there. Next slide. Here he is in a characteristic photo alone at 15. Next one. Here he is with his younger brother, Dakin. Dakin was 8 years younger than Tom and 10 years younger than Rose. And he was a favorite of the father. Dakin was the favored child. The father, C.C. Williams, and used to listen to the Cardinals games with Dakin. And he was in some ways the son that his father really wanted, as opposed to Tom, who was dreamy and always liked to spend time alone and was from a very early age consumed with writing. Williams' first published story was when he was 17. He wrote a story called The Vengeance of Nitocris when he was 17 that was published in the pulp magazine Weird Tales. Next slide. Here he is in his University City High School graduation photo. Next. This is Rose in 1927. In order to sort of salvage her youth, they gave her a debut, which apparently proved, according to Edwina in her memoir, a dismal failure. Next slide. The jewel box in Forest Park figures prominently, or at least as a prominent allusion in the Glass Menagerie. It's where Laura goes on her walks to find solitude. It's interesting that she, even though her name is Laura Wingfield, the family is Wingfield, she finds some solace with the penguins, flightless birds there in the jewel box. It sort of is an interesting emblem, the jewel box, of the Glass Menagerie itself, a wonderful metaphor.
The jewel box is full of flowers like roses.
Exactly.
And Rose is the name of the type for Laura.
Exactly. As you'll all remember, probably, she's called Blue Roses by her beau Jim in Glass Menagerie. His misunderstanding of the word pleurosis. Yes. Next. This is the interior of the jewel box as it would have appeared then in the 1930s. Judy referred to the pollution in St. Louis, and it was taken on Black Tuesday when the street lamps were used at noon. In St. Louis, they burned the bituminous soft coal, and this was a major issue, as Judy pointed out already. And the Post-Dispatch waged a major attack on this pollution, and the mayor actually appointed his own secretary to oversee attempts to reform it. And just hearkening back to that last slide, there's no need to change it, but one of the things that he wrote at Ben Blewett was a poem called Demon Smoke about air pollution. So Williams was sensitive to the fact of the air pollution, even as a 10th grader in junior high school. This is obviously the famous statue of St. Louis, and it's something that figures in one of his early short stories, a story called Oriflamme, in which the heroine leaves home, puts on a red dress, but then is confronted by this statue on Art Hill in Forest Park. Next slide, please. This is an image of the auditorium at Soldan High School, where Laura is humiliated by the fact of the clumping sound that the brace on her leg makes. Tennessee Williams went to Soldan for a semester, and then they transferred him to University City, actually for reasons of getting a better education. Next slide. Here's U City. Next one. This is the model for the Wingfield apartment at 4633 Westminster. Those of you that were fortunate enough to see the Tennessee Williams Festival this summer will know that they used the back of this building with the fire escapes as the backdrop for the actual production of the Glass Menagerie that was done outdoors. Next slide. Here he is at 24. Next slide. And Rose again outside St. Vincent's Sanatorium. This is all during the time he was at Washington University, by the way, in 1936-37. This is just Washington Avenue, looking west toward the International Shoe Company. And many of you will know this, but of course, St. Louis was a very highly populated city. It was the fourth largest city in the United States, and it was known as Shoe City, with the International Shoe Company as the largest shoe manufacturing center in the world at that time. Next. This is Williams while he was working at International Shoe.
And I think he had a desk job, right?
Well, he was, insofar as it was, yes, he did, but he was also a stocking clerk. So he was back and forth between the two. I think it was really more of a stocking clerk. It was more menial than a sort of exec. His father, of course, was a manager. This is Washington.
That job.
Yeah, not a desirable one. I found some early drafts of short stories in which Tommy, as he's called, throws himself out of the window of the. So Judy, your point about Blue Song as a kind of suicide note was certainly prescient, I think. He saw this as a kind of literally a dead-end job. Those stories were not published, but I quote from them simply because they reveal the mindset at that time, what it was like for him working at that job. This is a picture, of course, of Brookings Hall at Washington University, contemporary photo. Next. While he was at Washington University during 36 to 37, he had some good experiences. One of those was acting at Brown Hall in a play by Moliere. And Williams is the fourth figure from the right, who's gesticulating there. He was apparently a very bad actor. But the person who played Scapin was William J. Smith, a very eminent poet, later the poet laureate of the United States and a close friend of Tom Williams. He even in his early 90s wrote a memoir about their friendship, which is a wonderful book. So, this is a reminder of the sort of experiences in St. Louis that Tennessee Williams didn't really want to remind us of. He wanted us to think that he was a writer from the South who somehow stepped out of the backwoods of Clarksdale and onto the Broadway stage, but that was not true.
I think.
Yes, go ahead.
I don't know how many more pictures, but I think we better start taking some questions.
Okay.
Are there a lot more pictures? If there's one more, let's take a peek. But
there are actually a few more, I think. We can go through them quickly. Why don't you just run through them and I won't say anything. Here he is at Wash U. He's on the extreme left. Go ahead, next slide. That's a poem that he wrote while he was here. Next. These are his friends at Washington University. Next slide. This is the Blue Book and how it appeared when I first saw it. You see, it says
You know, just
Washington
looking
University
at that,
Press.
my stomach clenches up. Just the sight of a blue book takes me back.
Yes, exactly. Next, this is the manuscript of Blue Song, the way I saw it. This is Mivasha, a page from the script of Mivasha. Next. This is Candles to the Sun that both Judy and I referenced, the play about the Alabama mines that he was doing, that he wrote, and that was produced in 1937. These are images of his mother. And this is Laurette Taylor as Amanda in Glass Menagerie. Next, Julie Hayden as Laura in the original production of the Glass Menagerie. It opened in Chicago and then went to Broadway and made his stardom overnight. Next, it's an early painting. Tennessee Williams loved to paint, especially as he got older. And this is a self-portrait. And the inscription, which is difficult to read, says, "Very flattering even then, Tennessee." Next, this is the article in the Post that Judy mentioned, "St. Louisans cold, smug, complacent," in 1947. This is Creve Coeur Lake, which is the subject of a late play of his, and we're almost at the end of the slideshow now. Go on, next. These are some shots of A Lovely Day, Sunday for Creve Coeur, a later play where he revisits St. Louis with a much more conciliatory perspective in that comedy. Next, also from that show. And here he is at Graham Chapel in 1977, coming back to speak, give a poetry reading. I think that's the last, oh yes. And this is where his burial in Calvary. And of course, Rose is buried there too with the inscription, "Blow out your candles, Laura." The final words of the Glass Menagerie. Okay, and there we go. So we have some time for
So
questions.
wonderful. Shall I see
There's a couple in the chat too. Well, Marilyn Pittler, Henry Schvey is speaking on, she wanted everybody to know that Henry Schvey is speaking on his book Blue Song at the Jewish Book Festival, November 14th at 7 p.m. And prior, we are providing a bus tour with the History Museum on Tennessee Williams, haunts in St. Louis at 1. So there's some information for you as well.
And Hillary Gann, who is present on this Zoom call, is the person who is the head of the book festival, and she's going to be orchestrating all of that. So I look forward to seeing you again then. Any questions?
I have a question. I was very struck by the book itself, and also by the fact that while I'd heard of at least 2 of the plays, there were so many more that I had never heard of. And I was wondering, for example, why Not About Nightingale.
I think you muted out, Stephen.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was struck by the fact that there are at least 2 plays that all of us associate with Tennessee Williams and have probably seen and read, but there were many more that I'd never heard about till I'd read your book. And I was wondering why it took so long for some of them, like Not About Nightingales, to actually get staged.
That's a fascinating story, and the book goes into that fact. Not About Nightingales was only published 16 years after Williams died, and some 60 years after it was written. So it's astonishing what happens. I mean, it's, first of all, in answer to your question, Stephen, and it's a very good one, Williams was obsessive about writing. He wrote every day his entire life, and he would churn out pages and pages and pages, and sometimes these pages were lost. Sometimes they were collected. In the case of Not About Nightingales, however, it was a play that it's set in a men's prison, and it simply was intended to be produced in St. Louis for the Mummers, but because of a kind of theatrical accident, the Mummers, the amateur group that Williams wrote for, shut down. They disbanded. And so the project never took off. And the manuscript was housed, I believe, at his mother's home in Clayton, and was then transferred in bulk to the Harry Ransom Center in Texas. And it was only discovered in the 1990s by Vanessa Redgrave and by representative of the Alley Theater in Houston. And they produced the play. And of course, it was remarkable. In this case, it was a remarkable success because it brought to light a different playwright, not the playwright we thought about. It's, again, as I said, it's based upon a true story that took place in Holmesburg, Pennsylvania, about a group of prisoners who were literally roasted to death by a corrupt warden. But there's also an I figure, the figure of this writer who's known as Canary Jim. And at the end, he jumps out the window to try and escape. It's not clear whether he makes it or not, but it's again interesting for the St. Louis connection. Here, Williams is writing about a prison riot in Pennsylvania, but the central character is a persona who is trying to write and who finds salvation in swimming. He literally swims away. And Williams, even in St. Louis, found his only peace at the Lorelei Natatorium in the Central West End. And so why this particular play was lost had to do with accident.
Other plays, Stairs from the Roof, in which, again, there's the idea of freedom in the open space. A guy working at a building very much like International Shoe. He goes up to the roof all the time. That's where he seeks refuge.
Yes, and it's also interesting. It's also interesting in reference to your point, Judy, about the pollution, because he goes up to the roof, and then he goes beyond the roof. He finds this sort of fantasy world outside on the roof, which of course didn't really exist. So in that play, Stairs to the Roof.
And that play, which Henry, you directed it, didn't you?
No, I didn't. No,
Tom did it, and U of I.
Oh yes, Tom did. Yes, it
Yeah.
was. Yes, here at the
Again,
festival.
there was a famous professor in Illinois who had to piece that play together from draft after draft. She found pages here, she found pages there, and they were in no order. It took her years.
Yes, absolutely. Her name is Aline Hale, I believe, who you're talking about. And absolutely, she recreated the play from these drafts that were there again at the University of Texas.
I see there is a hand up, but there's no name attached to it. 773-9813.
I don't see any hand, but I do see a couple of questions in the
Okay.
chat. And so MJ Kornfeld would like to know who chose the inscription for Rose's headstone.
I believe it was, I don't know 100% certainty, but I believe it was either Dakin or Williams' executor who supervised the burial. There was a lot of controversy but of course it's a very appropriate one. So I don't know that it's sort of published as to who actually made that choice, made that decision. But the decision to bury him in St. Louis was very controversial and still is. Williams had expressly decided that his burial should be at sea. He wanted his ashes to be scattered at the very place where the poet Hart Crane committed suicide off the Florida coast. And Dakin chose to disregard those orders and have him buried in St. Louis, which I think many scholars feel is a cruel irony. However, in my estimation, in some ways, it's all too appropriate. St. Louis was always the place Williams wanted to escape from, but it was always the place he had to keep coming back to. So I'm not sure who selected that that inscription, but there is peculiarly enough, there's a Russian Orthodox cross on William's gravestone, which you may have seen on the slide. And that was selected by his executrix, who
A
was
crazy
Russian.
actress.
Yes.
I'm sorry, just my 2 cents. She was
No.
nuts.
Yes. A crazy actress, did you say? Or
Yes, I said a crazy Russian actress.
yes, that's right. Her
And-
name was
and
Lady
she did that.
Saint-Just.
And Dakin describes the coffin that they chose as an Orthodox Jewish coffin, by which he meant entirely plain.
Yes.
It's not at all clear how thoughtful anyone was in making these decisions,
Yes.
but decisions were made, I think is
Mhm.
how they put it.
MJ has another question as well. That she would like to know, do we know if the legend is true that Williams failed English at U City High?
I think that that's probably not true, but I doubt that he failed, but his grades were not very good at U City. But I would emphasize the fact of what he learned at U City rather than, he certainly failed at Wash U. He got a D in drama at Wash U and in drama course. But I don't know that he failed English at U City. But I think U City gave him a tremendous amount. They encouraged his writing. They published, U City Pep published his travel stories, for example. So he was beginning to get a reputation, although he didn't really do well academically. So I don't know that that's true, but I suspect it's false, that rumor.
So Marilyn, do you have unmute yourself?
You may have said this and it missed me, but I'm under the impression from reading the book that Dakin and Tom were not close. And I almost felt at the end, or I did feel at the end, that it was like the final blow, sort of nailing down the lid of the coffin, when Dakin decided to bring him back and bury him in St. Louis, knowing that that's not what his brother wanted, but this was like his final, too bad, this is where you're going to be kind of thing.
Yeah, it's hard to interpret these gestures. You're right, they were not close. But I mean, Tennessee resented Dakin principally because of the experience in 1969. Dakin had him interned at Barnes Hospital, where he was sort of removed cold turkey from his addictions to alcohol and drugs. On the other hand, I think almost everyone that knew Williams realizes that Dakin saved his life by having him forcibly interned there. Dakin never told him that after 10 days, there was no way that the hospital could keep him there without his will. They just sort of fudged it. But Tennessee took him out of his will, and I think obviously Dakin resented that. At the same time, when I knew Dakin, and he really expressed nothing but love and admiration for his brother. So there wasn't an obvious sense that this was sort of payback. What was operating psychologically is another question, whether there was some sort of subliminal payback. What Dakin said was that the executrix, Lady Saint-Just, and John Eastman, his lawyer, were going to have him buried in Waynesville, Ohio, along with the Dakin grandparents. And Dakin's rationalization of the move was that he felt that he deserved to be buried someplace that was central to his life and more prominent than obscure burial ground in Waynesville. Whether that was actually psychologically the case, we don't know. Some critics have even suggested that Dakin was trying to make money off the burial in St. Louis and make it a kind of tourist attraction. John Lahr in his biography quotes that that maybe so. So I don't know that there was some love-hate there going on, but I don't think it was simply one or the other. I think there was probably a mixture of things.
As in all families.
As in all families, many of them, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Dakin would come to the Tennessee Williams Festival every year and enjoy the prominence that gave him. He would wear a purple blazer and hold forth. And he spoke even at our conference. And he assisted me with the conference in many respects. So I think he was very much a devotee, but how much of that was also accompanied by significant jealousy, I don't know that we can ascertain for sure. Marilyn?
One final comment, and that's going back to Jewish Book Festival. We had a meeting today, and I understand that at the end of your talk on the 14th, you're going to have some of your students participating in a reading of one of the unpublished one-acts.
Yes.
And everybody listening on the Zoom now, please come to Book Festival. This is going to be an exciting day with the bus tour and listening to your talk and to be able to hear one of these unpublished works. I'm really, really excited.
Thank you very much for saying that, Marilyn. So the hope is that, yes, we are going to do a performance of sorts and publish this play and perform this play, Mi Vasha, which really no one knows about and really is at the heart of his St. Louis experience. I briefly referenced it, but thank you for reminding people that we will be doing a performance of it as well.
Thank you.
Do we have any further questions this afternoon? Judy, were you going to say something?
I was only going to say thank you to everyone who joined in. Thank you, Henry, for coming. And this book, you ought to pick it up. I bet they have it for sale at the festival, right?
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you
It's a
so much.
wonderful book. Thank you, Judith.
And I'd like to
David.
thank Judy for the wonderful questions that she asked. They were very provocative and really in-depth. So thank you so much. And thank you to Judith and to Stephen Cohen as well.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you on our program today. And Stephen, did you have something else you would like to say?
Just to say thank you to both Judy and to Henry, and thank you all for joining us.
It was a wonderful program. Thank you so much. Hope to see you at the book festival. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.